The United States is the largest oil producer in history. It also imports about 6 million barrels of crude a day. People usually assume that gap is politics or sabotage or somebody's bad deal. It isn't, it's hardware. The machines that turn oil into fuel were built for a different kind of oil than the one America now drills, and that single fact explains a trade flow worth hundreds of billions of dollars a year. This is a file about a mismatch, not a shortage, not a conspiracy, not a policy failure exactly. A mismatch between what comes out of American ground and what American refineries were built to swallow. We checked it against federal data, against the refining industry's own statements, and against the trade numbers. And along the way, we found that one of the most quoted statistics about American refining has been wrong for 30 years. Let's start with the thing that confuses everybody. Here's the shape of the confusion. America produces more oil than any nation in history. America is a net exporter of crude oil and refined products taken together. And America still imports something like 6 million barrels of crude oil every single day. All three of those are true at once, and they sound like they can't be. They can, because oil is not one commodity. It's a family of them, and a refinery is not a general purpose machine. It's a machine tuned to a specific member of that family. Get the member wrong and the economics fall apart. Crude is graded on two scales that have nothing to do with each other. The first is density, measured as API gravity. Light crude flows easily and gives you a high proportion of gasoline and jet fuel without much work. Heavy crude is thick and viscous, and it leaves behind a large residual fraction that has to be broken down before it's worth anything at all. The second scale is sulfur. Weak crude is low sulfur. Sour crude carries more, and that sulfur has to be chemically stripped before the fuel can meet any modern emissions standard. American shale sits at the easy end of both. Canadian oil sands bitumen sits at the hard end of both. So how much of the American system is built for the hard end? The refining industry answers this itself. The American fuel and petrochemical manufacturer states that nearly 70% of U.S. refining capacity runs most efficiently with heavier crude, and that 90% of crude oil imports into the United States are heavier than American shale. Now, that's a trade association describing its own members, so treat it as what it is. But notice the direction. They're explaining why their members can't simply buy more American oil, at a moment when buying more American oil is the popular position. That's an admission against interest, and the physical evidence backs it up. You don't have to take the industry's word for it, because heavy crude capability leaves a physical trace. It's called a coker. Coking is the process that takes the thick residue sitting at the bottom of a heavy barrel and cracks it into something you can actually sell. A refinery with a coker was built to run heavy crude. A refinery without one generally was not. The Energy Information Administration puts total American coking capacity at about 2.79 million barrels per stream day, spread across more than 50 refineries. The cokers themselves are a small slice of throughput. That's not the point. The point is which refineries have them, because the upgrading hardware marks the whole plant it sits inside. There's a standard measure of how much upgrading a refinery has been given. It's called the Nelson Complexity Index, and it scores all the secondary processing, the cracking, the coking, the reforming, against plain distillation, which is set at 1.0. A simple hydroskimming refinery scores about 2, a cracking refinery about 5. A coking refinery that can turn heavy sour crude into high-value fuel scores 9 or above. The American system averages around 11, one of the highest national averages on Earth. Europe sits near 6.5. And here's the thing. The figure you'll see quoted almost everywhere for the United States is 9.5. That's from an oil and gas journal survey published in 1996. It has been circulating as a current fact for 30 years. Now, a fair objection. These aren't single feedstock machines. Heavy optimized refineries run blended slates, and they do shift toward lighter grades when the price rewards it. Gulf Coast refiners did exactly that through 2025, as the discount on heavy Canadian barrels narrowed. So why not just keep going? Because of the upgrading unit, a coker or hydrocracker needs a minimum volume of heavy residual material to run efficiently. Feed a heavy optimized refinery nothing but light crude, and the single most expensive piece of equipment on the site sits idle, which destroys the economics that justify building it. Partial shifts happen constantly. Wholesale conversion doesn't because it isn't a slight decision. It's a demolition and rebuild decision. If the mismatch is real, it should show up in the trade data. It does, in both directions at once. On the way in, the American Petroleum Institute reports that over 60% of U.S. crude imports are classified as heavy at 27 degrees API gravity or below, out of 6.6 million barrels a day of total imports in 2024. Canada supplied 62% of that, and its share has since risen to 63.4%. Those barrels are overwhelmingly oil sands bitumen blends, heavy, sour, delivered by pipeline into exactly the Midwest and Gulf Coast plant, built to process them. Even the Middle East Gulf, at about 8% of imports, was selling 88% medium sour. Everybody is selling into the same requirement. And on the way out, domestic shale production, generally 40 degrees API and up and very low sulfur, exceeds what heavy optimized American refineries can absorb efficiently. So the surplus leaves. Gulf Coast crude exports have been running somewhere between 3.2 and 4 million barrels a day, essentially all of it light sweet shale, sold to refiners abroad who either don't have heavy crude upgrading plant of their own or simply want the lighter grade, which gives you the swap. The same coastline is the country's largest exit point for light crude and one of its largest entry points for heavy crude. Production and refining capacity are not mismatched in quantity, they're mismatched in quantity. Here's where the system actually stands. As of the 1st of January 2026, American operable distillation capacity was 18.2 million barrels per calendar day across 130 refineries. That's down about 250,000 barrels a day from a year earlier, roughly 1%, and the second consecutive annual decline. Two closures drove it. LyondellBasell ended refining at its Houston plant in March 2025, and Phillips 66 shut its Los Angeles refinery that October. And notice what those closures were about. One was a pivot to petrochemicals, one was California market and regulatory conditions. Neither was an attempt to rebalance the national crude slate. This file was commissioned from a research brief carrying 37 citations. Before a word of it was written, we checked every load-bearing claim against the primary source it named. 8 figures didn't survive. The complexity number, as you've heard, was 30 years old. The Gulf Coast concentration was understated by 8 percentage points. It's about 54% of national capacity, not 46 to 50. The refinery count was a year out of date. A net decline had been reported, as if it were the gross closure total, and then a percentage was calculated from it. And a Wood Mackenzie figure presented as current analysis turned out to be commissioned advocacy work with data marked 2010. We haven't corrected those quietly. Everyone is published with what the brief said and what the source says. So does this correct itself? 15 years into the shale boom, it hasn't. Refiners have consistently signaled they won't make large capital commitments to convert heavy-oriented assets toward lighter feedstocks, and they said so through 2025, under direct political pressure to say the opposite. The reason is unglamorous. The existing plant stays profitable running discounted heavy imports, and the conversion economics don't justify the spend. Absent a change in refiner margins or a policy aimed specifically at slate conversion, the dual-track system holds. Several million barrels a day of light sweet crude out. A comparable volume of heavy sour crude in, mostly from Canada. That is not a market failing to clear. It's a market clearing exactly as the hardware dictates. The complete file is online with all 5 parts. The overview, what the refineries were built for, the trade that results from it, the figures that didn't survive checking, and the sources and method behind all of it. That's the file. Every figure in it is linked to the primary source it came from, and the 8 that didn't survive checking are published too, on a page of their own. Broadside News Group. Verified.